In the most recent episode of the Partee podcast, Hannah McBeth went into detail with Macie Velediaz about the whole situation with her pregnancy, and it certainly brought up some very, very interesting questions that the Pro Tour will almost certainly have to come to a resolution with. Let's go over what she said and what we can do about it. So just a brief TLDR, Macie Velediaz had a contract with DD. DD gave her a pretty low number for her 2024 contract. She was like, probably not. Hey, I'm pregnant. She came back stating that she'll probably do a few less events this year. And then DD came back with a lower number and she announced, I just don't really think I can make that work because I'm not really going to be making any money. So ultimately it just did not pan out and she ended up signing with DGA. And what's kind of crazy is that this feels like it should have been a situation where stuff like this has to have already happened. So there should be like a precedent stating like, okay, you're going through pregnancy, you're going to be like delivering a baby in the middle of the season, there is going to be some time off and we'll cover that kind of extended period through some form of like maternity leave. But that is very much not the case in the sport. And with her due date being middle of June, there's just basically no way that she's going to be able to do much of the tour this year, and stated in the podcast that she has just started throwing a little bit. And so while it certainly feels a little bit weird for that like middle tier player in FPO, it seems like the money isn't necessarily there, but it certainly is growing. The popularity of FPO has just totally exploded, but this is certainly evidence that it has not exploded enough to make these manufacturers truly give the players a standard set of benefits. And Macie did say there was miscommunication on both sides, where she didn't necessarily communicate enough and they didn't communicate enough, and so it was definitely a mess. But if you are DD, you have such a good possibility to market this as a great boost for sales, not a downside. I know people mentioned like a gender reveal disc, or you could have a signature series of runs for lightweight discs that are targeted towards like kids. There are so many possibilities to turn this around as a positive instead of a negative, but with changes in administration at DD, that was certainly not part of the equation, it seems. But the biggest thing about this whole situation is that it'll create a domino effect. There are so many more FPO players coming into the sport. They're often pretty young, so they will have to start planning for a family, figuring out how that whole situation is going to work. Because if you're MPO, sure, your wife gets pregnant, you can spend a little bit of time away from the tour without any real issue, as evidenced by Paul and Simon and Emerson. But for FPO, it is just so much harder to kind of figure out how that whole situation is going to work, because your body is the product. If you can't throw with good distance, good power, good form, then you will not be an elite level player by any means. And so it will inevitably take more time to get back to that basis level where you can play like 1,000 rated golf. And so zooming out and looking outside of the sport, I looked at a couple of benchmarks that I thought was a good kind of baseline for what other people are doing. And while it is certainly murky water because nobody is officially an employee, they are all contractors, which makes it just so muddy, but that's okay. If you are familiar with the FMLA or Family and Medical Leave Act, they require businesses with at least 50 employees to provide 12 weeks of unpaid maternity leave. Now, obviously this probably isn't super applicable because we have no employees on the Pro Tour, at least for the players. Unpaid wouldn't really solve the issue, but it does set the stage for what it kind of should be. There should be a set standard for what you can expect when you're trying to have a baby during the Pro Tour season. And looking at golf, they have a pretty good policy where their tour director actually stated, our maternity policy is intended to encourage athletes to have families. The goal has always been to help players achieve their dreams as both a competitor and a mom. Under the current policy, a player has the option to take maternity leave in the year in which they are pregnant and give birth, or take it a year after the birth. By choosing to take maternity leave, a player restricts herself to a maximum of 10 starts. However, the player won't lose her status when she returns the following year. Now, obviously golf has way more money, so this is maybe just a pipe dream for now, but it would be good to kind of solidify these pro players that have tour cards that are essential to the tour be given the same amount of rights as basically every other business. Now, obviously we know that is not the case at the moment because the money is just not there, but seeing the trajectory in disc golf still rapidly increasing, I certainly think this is a future reality that we will live in, where pro players, both men and women, have some form of maternity and paternity leave. And I don't know if that's being paid by the Pro Tour or their actual sponsor. It certainly seems that the Pro Tour is probably actually more responsible for it, because sponsors tend to be like on average a 1-year contract, whereas these pro players stay around for much longer, and the value to the Pro Tour for players remaining on tour is very high. And Macie went on to say that other people are doing this with phenomenal fashion. Paige Shue, Jen Allen, Kristen Tatar, obviously, they are managing to do full-time tour life with kids. And while I'm sure there's probably stuff in their contract that states they can do a couple fewer events than maybe the average tour player, they still are able to make it work. So I certainly have high hopes for the Pro Tour and all the disc golf sponsors to make it work. But as of right now, it does not seem like there's a great solution for anybody that is trying to start a family. And Macie was definitely the first to kind of kick off how these manufacturers and Pro Tour decide tried to manage this particular situation. And I really hope the decision being made is not just to ignore it, because this is going to remain a big part of Pro Tour life, whether or not the Pro Tour actually decides to recognize it as an issue. But once again, I just don't know who would actually make the first step towards accommodating people, because if it is sponsors, well, the player is going to be gone potentially the next year. If it's a Pro Tour, they might be like, hey, we have no money to afford this. That's on you. So the culpability is just totally not clear as to who is actually responsible for this. But both tour and sponsors do benefit and profit off these Pro Tour players being a sponsored player by them. So it certainly seems like the least they can do is accommodate stuff as maternity leave and paternity leave. So with that said, what do you guys think? Do you see a viable way out of this situation, or do you kind of think it'll be mucky for years to come? I'd love to know. Thank you so much for watching. Wild Runs, signing out. Peace.